Vault 13, File 481A. Recovered material, 6 magnetic reel-to-reel tapes, oxide flaking, recorded between September and December of 1983. Label: The Abernathy Broadcast, WZPX 1130 AM, Night Talk. The reels arrived inside a dented courier case, sealed with customs tape, dated 1997. No sender. The air inside smelled faintly of mildew and ozone, the scent of electronics that have been silent too long. Each tape contained partial late-night broadcasts hosted by one Harold Abernathy, a regional radio personality based somewhere in the upper Midwest. He appears to have run a small talk radio segment devoted to local callers, strange experiences, and what he called the thin places. At first, there was nothing unusual, static, advertisements for tire shops, weather reports. But the later reels, they changed. The call-in topics became narrower, stranger. The host's tone shifted from patient curiosity to something more intimate, almost devotional. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when the broadcasts began diverging from normal programming, but several entries in the station's schedule reference overnight interference and unlicensed cross-modulation, suggesting the transmissions did not originate entirely from the studio. Cross-analysis with regional FCC records confirms that WZPX officially went dark in November of 1983 after an unexplained electrical fire destroyed the primary transmitter site. No human remains were recovered from the building, though reports mention the scent of burnt copper and a rhythmic humming from the walls that persisted for several days afterward. The content of the final tape, labeled Episode 12, The Voice Beneath, deviates sharply from the earlier recordings. The signal degrades midway through the program, and listeners appear to be phoning in from impossible locations. One caller references a date months after the broadcast's supposed end. Another repeats the host's words seconds before he speaks them. Attempts to remaster the reels revealed faint background audio on each track, whispering frequencies outside the range of speech, resonating in harmonic intervals consistent with human cardiac rhythms. We believe the source is not mechanical. These tapes were transferred, catalogued, and sealed under the restricted subsection, Acoustic Phenomena. I have reviewed the transcripts compiled by Vault technicians and, for the sake of completeness, reconstructed the sequence as faithfully as possible. What follows is the compiled secondary record of the Abernathy broadcast, drawn from transcript fragments, engineer notes, and caller logs recovered from the surviving reels. To any future archivist who encounters this file, monitor your playback equipment closely. Several reels emit residual static when powered off, and the faint echo of a voice can be heard if the room is silent long enough. It is unclear whether this effect originates from magnetic bleed or something else still broadcasting. The Archivist, Vault 13. The reels began innocuously enough. Surface noise, station identifiers, the faint wheeze of a chair as someone leaned into a microphone. Harold Abernathy, The late-night voice of WZPX spoke in the gentle drawl common to small-town broadcasters of that era. Practiced calm, measured pauses, a trace of loneliness between the words. I listened to the first tape in one sitting. The air within the playback room of Vault 13 carries its own particular hush, a layered quiet of filtration systems and insulation baffles, and the recording's ambient hum fit perfectly into that silence. Nothing strange at first. Weather reports, community bulletins, the easy chatter of an unseen engineer moving paper near a microphone. But then, 22 minutes into the first reel, something shifted. The host took a call from a woman identified only as Donna from Eldridge. Her tone was nervous, respectful, perhaps embarrassed. She told Abernathy that for several nights her home telephone had rung after midnight, and when she lifted the receiver, she heard his program. Not a rebroadcast, not static, but his voice, reading headlines and taking calls she hadn't yet heard on the air. The archivist who came before me noted a faint hesitation in Abernathy's reply, as though he too heard something unusual through his headset. When the vault's technicians isolated the audio layers, they found what they described as predictive echoing, the faint duplication of the host's speech, anticipatory by a fraction of a second. Normally, such a pattern could be explained by signal delay, line noise, or a transmitter feedback loop. Yet, the echo was not a delay. It preceded the primary waveform. The host's laughter on the tape sounds strained. He attempts reassurance, explaining radio bounce, atmospheric reflection, any theory that keeps the world rational. Then the line disconnects. Static. The familiar dead air of the early 80s. That moment seems to have affected him more than he admitted. The second and third reels show subtle changes. Longer pauses, less music between segments, a quiet tension in his voice, as though he is listening for something behind his own transmission. The following week's program begins with a direct reference to the incident. Abernathy recounts Donna's call and invites her, or anyone else, to share similar experiences. He receives one response. A man who claims to work at a radio relay station several counties away. This man insists that 2 days before Donna's call, he intercepted a partial recording of the same conversation. He recognized Abernathy's voice, the same cadence, the same phrasing, but the timestamp embedded in the transmission log read October 12th, nearly a month in the future. Abernathy's nervous chuckle returns, brittle this time. He tries to keep the conversation light, to rationalize, yet there is a faint background tone behind his words, a long, low oscillation, like the hum of a fluorescent ballast beginning to fail. It rises in amplitude as the man speaks, reaching a sustained note just before the call cuts out. The host's closing remarks afterward sound rehearsed, but his breathing betrays him. That tone persists faintly through the rest of the reel. Even when he plays commercials, even when the studio should have been silent, a low resonance continues beneath the broadcast. Something not picked up by the microphone itself, but present within the transmission band. The earlier archivists labeled it simply as The hum. I ran a frequency analysis on the digital transfer. It centers at 31.7 Hz, oscillating with irregular modulation, roughly equivalent to the tempo of a human heartbeat. One might expect interference from nearby electrical lines or the natural resonance of studio equipment, but the signal continues even when the broadcast transitions to outdoor field recordings. At one point, Abernathy conducts a brief weather update from the parking lot after a thunderstorm. Yet, the hum persists, steady and internal, untouched by ambient noise. What caught my attention next was not the sound itself, but the pattern it seemed to impose on his speech. Over subsequent broadcasts, Abernathy begins unconsciously pacing his sentences to the rhythm of that low beat, as though adjusting himself to it. The tempo of his monologue subtly slows. His breaths fall into sync with each rise and fall of the undertone. By late September, the real markings change. The engineer who had been annotating each tape leaves increasingly brief notes. Static worsening, modboard replaced, feedback persists. The handwriting trembles toward the end, and on the final entry before the transmitter fire, there is only a single line written in all capitals. Do not tune below 11:30. The following broadcast is the last one fully intact. Abernathy begins by thanking listeners for their patience with the station's technical difficulties. He mentions sleeplessness, apologizes for sounding tired, and plays a brief local jingle before resuming his usual open-line format. His words are slower now, quieter, as though the energy required to speak on air had begun to drain him. What stands out most is his sudden fixation on reflection and time. He muses aloud about radio waves that continue long after a station goes dark, signals bouncing endlessly between atmospheric layers, fading but never disappearing. Somewhere out there, he says, my voice is still circling the globe, calling to whoever might be awake. There is a brief silence afterward. You can almost hear him listening for an answer. When I stopped the playback, I found myself doing the same. The technicians who cataloged the reels after their arrival in Vault 13 noted a peculiar property. Every time the recordings were left running past their indexed endpoint, the same phrase surfaced faintly from the static, regardless of reel or sequence. It's not part of the original transmission. The pitch and tone differ from Abernathy's voice, yet it rides the same harmonic frequency as the hum. The words vary slightly with each playback, but the structure remains constant, a greeting followed by a request to keep listening. One intern described hearing his own name spoken within that murmur. Another swore that the voice addressed Abernathy directly, using the present tense. You're still on the air. When we tested those claims, the phenomenon proved inconsistent. Some listeners heard only noise. Others reported distinct speech. None of them agreed on the exact wording, only the cadence, a slow rise and fall like someone speaking from underwater. I have heard it myself, though only once. It came near the end of the second reel when the static reached its usual crescendo before fading out. A whisper threaded through the distortion, low and deliberate. "We hear you." It could have been an artifact of expectation, the mind imposing order upon randomness. Yet the phrase synchronized perfectly with the pulse of the hum, as though the voice rode upon it, each syllable cresting on the vibration. The fire that destroyed WZPX's transmitter site occurred less than 2 weeks later. Local reports described a blue-white surge, visible across 3 counties. The official cause was recorded as an electrical overload. However, the surviving maintenance logs mention no lightning strike, no mechanical failure. Power simply built and built until every circuit melted down to slag. No human remains were recovered, though personal items found in the debris suggest Abernathy was present in the control room at the time of ignition. His wristwatch was fused to the console dial, the glass warped inward. When I review the surviving material, I find myself wondering whether the ignition was not an accident, but a culmination. The point at which something unseen finally grounded itself through him. There are 3 more reels after the fire, their origins uncertain. The station had already been off the air. Local technicians deny making them. Yet they exist. Same label, same handwriting, though the ink appears slightly paler, as though it had faded faster than time should allow. They contain what sounds like Abernathy still broadcasting, addressing his invisible audience, urging them to listen closely. Each reel ends mid-sentence. The next phase of my review concerned those post-fire reels, the 3 that should not exist. Every index mark on their spools shows signs of deliberate splicing, as though multiple short fragments were joined together with trembling hands. The oxide coating had begun to bubble in places, producing faint rust-colored residue that smells of ozone and scorched insulation. When threaded through a calibrated deck, the reels play cleanly for a moment before dropping into low-band distortion, as if they were captured through a failing transmitter rather than a microphone. At first, I assumed these were fabrications, perhaps local hoaxes made after the station's destruction. Yet, the background ambiance is unmistakable. Each contains the same acoustic profile as WZPX's control room, a shallow echo from the glass partition, the faint tick of a wall clock, the rhythmic hiss of the cooling fan. Someone recorded these in that space, after it was declared unsafe to enter. The voice that follows is recognizably Abernathy's, but thinner, more deliberate, his inflection stripped of warmth. He greets an audience as if nothing has happened. "Good evening, friends," he says. "You're still listening." He speaks of the weather, though his descriptions do not match local records. He names constellations that would not have been visible at that hour. Occasionally he pauses, as though awaiting a response that never comes. Technicians at the vault analyze the noise floor beneath his speech. Embedded within it are pulses, brief, percussive bursts, repeating every 12 seconds. They resemble the carrier identification tones used by long-wave maritime beacons, yet no known transmitter matches their pattern. If you overlay those pulses atop the hum from the earlier reels, a faint interference pattern emerges. alternating bands of constructive and destructive resonance that form what one acoustics specialist called a standing wave of impossible origin. During my second playback, I noticed something subtler. Abernathy begins referring to his callers in the past tense, recounting their stories as though reading obituaries. "Donna from Eldridge," he murmurs, "no longer answers the phone. The man at the relay," he says, "found silence at every frequency." These statements are followed by stretches of dead air during which a faint clicking can be heard. Not mechanical, more like fingernails brushing the microphone screen. By the midpoint of the second illicit reel, his speech dissolves into monotone. He starts reading numbers, long sequences that at first appear random, but later correspond to recorded timestamps from the original broadcasts. It is as though he is reciting the archive itself, committing every moment to repetition. I compared those sequences to the station's surviving logbooks. Several timestamps he names never existed. They reference hours that were never scheduled for transmission. When projected onto a standard 24-hour cycle, the missing entries fall between 12:06 a.m. and 12:09 a.m., the same 3-minute window during which Donna reported her phantom phone calls. One can imagine coincidence, but the alignment is too precise. The field report filed by the recovery team that located the tapes reads like a minor tragedy. The reels were discovered in 1996 during demolition of the old WZPX building. The crew had already stripped most of the wiring when one worker, a man named Crenshaw, noticed that the site's electrical sub-panel was still faintly warm. The feed lines had been severed years earlier, yet a residual current remained measurable across the grounding plate. Following the warmth back through the rubble, he uncovered a small steel case wedged between two collapsed wall studs. Inside were the reels, neatly labeled, wrapped in what appeared to be the remnants of an engineer's coat. Crenshaw later told investigators that he heard a low droning while handling the box, a vibration he assumed came from nearby equipment until he realized the power was disconnected. He dropped the case immediately, but for several minutes afterward, he reported a sensation of pressure behind the ears, as if the sound had entered through bone rather than air. When the tapes were delivered to regional authorities, no one claimed jurisdiction. The case was transferred twice, eventually landing in an evidence locker that would be emptied a year later during a routine archive purge. A private collector in Chicago acquired the lot at auction, unaware of their provenance. The vault purchased them anonymously in 2009 after the collector's death, the details of which remain sealed under family request. The accompanying inventory list, written in the collector's hand, includes one chilling notation beside the final reel. Interference persists even when unplugged. I spent several nights studying that final recording. Its audio quality is markedly poorer, but its content, or perhaps its intent, feels coherent. Abernathy introduces the program as Episode 12, The Voice Beneath. His words fluctuate between broadcast address and intimate confession. He speaks of feedback that follows him home, of hearing his own voice replayed from dark rooms. He mentions neighbors complaining that their radios pick up the station on unused frequencies, sometimes even through electric wiring or plumbing. Then his tone changes. "If you can hear me," he says softly, "then you're already tuned." The rest of the reel is almost entirely static, yet embedded within are faint syllables that form replies to his statements, delayed by only a fraction of a second. He asks, "Are you there?" And something like his own voice answers, "Always." Vault analysis confirms that those replies occupy a slightly different spectral signature, a few hertz lower than his baseline, enough to suggest the recording contains two overlapping vocal sources that share identical formant structures. In simpler terms, the voice responding is him, but not. I've heard recordings of feedback loops where sound from a speaker re-enters a microphone, creating an infinite echo that spirals into noise. This is something different. The replies are not repetitions but completions. The second voice finishing his thoughts as though aware of their destination. On one late segment, he begins counting backward from 10. The other voice counts forward from 1. They meet on 5 and fall silent together. Every playback ends abruptly there. No tape damage, no dropout, just a perfect surgical stop, as if someone had severed the signal at that exact instant. Archivists before me speculated endlessly about the cause. Some propose mundane explanations, overlapping short-wave broadcasts, induction through faulty equipment, even prank transmissions from nearby ham operators. Yet none account for the predictive elements, the echoes that anticipate rather than follow. One theory suggests that under rare atmospheric conditions, amplitude-modulated signals might refract through upper-layer inversion, effectively transmitting backwards in time by fractions of a second. The energy involved would be negligible, milliseconds at most, but enough perhaps to produce the illusion of foresight on tape. A comforting thought if only it explained the voice. The alternative is less technical and more unsettling, that Abernathy was not receiving feedback from the world, but from himself, refracted through whatever liminal space he had managed to open with his broadcast. A circuit completed not through machinery, but through consciousness. When I listen to those final minutes, I cannot help noticing how calm he sounds. There is no panic, no sign of distress. He accepts the phenomenon as one might accept the changing of seasons. His last coherent statement before the silence is almost tender. We stay on the air for as long as someone's listening. The line that follows, the one cut mid-word, may have been a farewell. Or perhaps it was an invitation. The technicians have since sealed the reels within electromagnetic shielding, though I doubt containment is truly necessary. Still, the residual hum occasionally bleeds into other recordings stored nearby. A log from last year notes that while cataloging unrelated materials, a junior archivist heard fragments of Abernathy's sign-off through his monitoring headset, despite no power to the reel deck. The incident was dismissed as pareidolia, yet the same phrase has been reported by 3 others in the months since. Good evening, friends. You're still listening. There is something profoundly human about that sentence. A simple need for connection carried beyond its natural boundary. Radio, after all, was built on the hope that a voice could bridge distance. Perhaps Abernathy merely succeeded too well. I sometimes wonder whether those ancient transmitters, straining against the static of decades, continue to pulse faintly in the ionosphere, a dying heartbeat repeating its final message. If so, the vault may only be intercepting an echo of an echo, a memory of sound looping through forgotten channels. Yet each time I conclude that thought, a different possibility rises unbidden, that what we are hearing is not the past calling forward, but the present being answered from behind. The final reel ends in a void of silence, yet that silence feels occupied. Every listener in the vault remarks on it differently. Some describe pressure in the chest, others the faint sense of a room breathing out of sync with their own. To quantify absence is impossible, but the effect is measurable. The ambient noise floor of the playback chamber drops by 2 decibels when the recording ceases, as though the air itself pauses to listen. For my part, I've learned to leave the deck running for several minutes after each reel completes. It isn't a procedural necessity, it's curiosity, the kind that erodes reason by degrees. Once, during those empty minutes, I caught what sounded like an exhalation near the left channel. A sigh, perhaps, or a mimicry of one. The vault's acoustics are engineered to perfection, but even perfection can't conceal suggestion. My review logs from that period show a gradual decline in objectivity. The earliest entries are technical, decibel readings, timestamps, magnetic deterioration rates. Later, they devolve into musings. Phrases like, Abernathy's cadence grows more human toward the end, and the silence feels rehearsed. When I reached the 12th playback of the final reel, a rhythmic interference began to creep into my own recordings. The hum, that 31.7 hertz pulse, bled faintly into my monitoring feed despite the shielding. At first, I assumed a grounding fault in the playback deck, but the pulse persisted even when the system was powered down. The technicians ran diagnostics. No error. The signal was external, ambient, present in the air itself. They traced it through several chambers, always attenuating toward the same location. The Northern Archive Vault, Row 13, Bay 5, where the reels were stored. That discovery prompted a temporary suspension of access. The vault director ordered electromagnetic isolation of the bay and instructed all personnel to log any auditory irregularities during off hours. Within days, 4 separate reports described a low voice echoing faintly through the ventilation system. Unintelligible, but rhythmic, like speech compressed into a single tone. The voice always stopped when approached. We recorded one such event using a parabolic microphone. Playback revealed nothing unusual at first, only the expected whine of the filtration fans. But when the audio was slowed, the pattern became clear. A steady oscillation in the subsonic range, resolving into words only at 1/4 speed. the phrase repeated 6 times before fading into silence. "Keep listening." The spectral signature of that voice matched the harmonic fingerprint of the Abernathy Broadcast reels. I have spent years surrounded by fragments of the past, and I know how easily the mind invents continuity where none exists. Yet something about this case feels deliberately threaded. Not random interference, but communication across a medium indifferent to time. Abernathy once said on air, "Every broadcast is a message in a bottle. You throw it into the static and hope someone hears." Perhaps, finally, someone did. Further investigation into the aftermath of WZPX uncovered additional irregularities. The town that surrounded the transmitter site, a modest collection of farms and supply shops, suffered a series of minor blackouts in the months following the fire. Electrical inspections found nothing unusual except one detail. The outages occurred precisely at 12:07 a.m., the same time Donna's phone calls began. When power returned, several residents reported hearing fragments of radio chatter through their home wiring. Voices murmuring beneath the hum of refrigerators, rhythmic pulses through fluorescent lights. One man claimed his pacemaker briefly synchronized with an external signal, causing his heart to beat in time with the radio. His physician dismissed the account, yet the man's medical records show a momentary deviation in cardiac rhythm, logged exactly at 12:07 a.m. The pattern continued for 3 nights, then ceased altogether. By then, most of the town's population had left. The area is largely deserted now, the transmitter ruins fenced off under a preservation order that cites environmental hazard. In the months after those findings, I began to notice subtle coincidences within Vault 13 itself. Each time I logged an entry for File 481-A, the clock above my station flickered for a fraction of a second, its second hand hesitating at the 7-minute mark past midnight. Digital systems recorded no anomaly, yet the motion was visible, a mechanical stutter that left the faint impression of repetition. More than once, I heard my own recorded notes play back, slightly ahead of their cue. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd misaligned the audio track. The second time, I listened more carefully. My voice, faint and distant, spoke the following sentence half a second before I did. "There will be no conclusive end to this investigation. The words are mine, the timing is not." It's tempting to romanticize such coincidences, to imagine Abernathy's lost signal reaching out through decades of dead air, seeking anyone who might hear. Yet the rational part of me knows that signals degrade, tape decays, and the world forgets its own noise eventually. Still, the hum persists. When I leave the monitoring room at night, I sometimes catch its resonance through the ventilation system, a low tremor that aligns with the rhythm of my steps. I tell myself it's machinery, the whisper of airflow, the tinnitus of a tired archivist. But there are nights when it synchronizes too perfectly with my breathing, as though adjusting itself to match. One might assume these details exaggerations, products of fatigue. The vault maintains strict schedules for precisely that reason. Isolation breeds imagination. But the security footage from 3:12 hours on February 7th disproves delusion. The Northern Archive cameras recorded a brief pulse of light within Bay 5, a blue-white flicker illuminating the containment shelf. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. When technicians reviewed the footage, the video contained no sound. Yet spectral analysis of the silent track revealed a pattern consistent with audio compression. Digital silence concealing data. When decompressed, the silence produced a faint tonal rhythm matching the hum's frequency. A voice emerges within that rhythm, thin, unstable, but articulate enough to form 4 words. We stay on air. I cannot determine whether that message originated from the reels or from something they carried. Energy leaves traces. Consciousness perhaps does as well. The longer I study these artifacts, the more I sense they are less recordings than residues. Impressions of will left imprinted upon magnetic grain. Abernathy's program was built on the intimacy of connection, strangers reaching through static to be heard. It's fitting, in a way, that his final legacy may be the ultimate continuation of that connection, a conversation that no longer requires transmission towers or wires, only the lingering echo of a voice that refuses silence. I have sealed File 07A under restricted status. Access requires dual authorization and mandatory monitoring for auditory hallucination indicators. Whether those measures matter is uncertain. For the sake of record, I will close this segment with my own observation. During my last playback session, the deck powered down unexpectedly at 12:07 a.m. The reels ceased motion, but the meters continued to register input, faint oscillations pulsing at exactly 130 beats per minute, matching an average human heart rate at rest. I leaned closer, foolishly, to listen. Within that pulse, beneath the mechanical ticks, a voice whispered a single phrase I could not misinterpret. "Good evening, friend." Then nothing. When I looked at the clock, the second hand was still paused at 7 minutes past 12. There is a point in every investigation when curiosity ceases to serve knowledge and begins instead to erode the investigator. For File 481-A, that point came silently, without revelation, without ceremony. One day, the reels were simply background noise in the catalog. The next, they were all anyone could hear. The vault functions on routine, filtration, hum, system checks, data synchronization. We live by repetition because repetition means order. But in the weeks following the last playback of the Abernathy reels, that rhythm faltered. The first sign came from the audio wing. 2 technicians performing unrelated transfers reported that the reel decks across the hall powered on simultaneously, 12 of them, aligned to no schedule. The logs show no command issued from the control terminal. When staff arrived to investigate, each deck was spinning at the same slow rate, 1 revolution every 12 seconds, the number 12 again. The engineers dismissed it as a synchronization glitch, until they noticed the meters pulsing faintly in the same cadence as the hum that haunted Abernathy's recordings. I listened to their account and requested access to the surveillance footage. On the video, the moment the decks begin to turn, a faint flicker crosses the frame. Not light exactly, more like the brief absence of shadow. The same phenomenon appears in two other cameras down the hall, a wave of illumination traveling north to south, terminating at Vault Section 13B, Bay 5, where File 481A is stored. That evening, I conducted a routine integrity check of the containment shelf. Everything appeared normal. Shielding intact, humidity within limits, temperature steady. Yet the electromagnetic sensors registered a subtle oscillation emanating from the case. 31 to 32 hertz, fluctuating like breath. I instructed the night staff to run a frequency isolation test. Instead of static, the speakers produced a faint rhythmic knock, like fingertips brushing the casing from within. The sound lasted precisely 72 seconds before fading. When I replayed the recorded data later, the knocks formed an unmistakable pattern. Morse code. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. The translation WZP, incomplete but close enough to the station's call sign to freeze every person in that room. We classified the event as non-reproducible interference, sealed the case, and filed a report to the Vault Directorate. Procedure demands that any anomalous feedback be quarantined for 48 hours. During that period, the oscillation continued even with all electronics removed from the chamber. Instruments left nearby developed faint magnetization patterns matching the same rhythmic pulse. It was then that the first dreams began. Several staff members, myself included, reported hearing snippets of broadcast chatter in their sleep, tuning noises, station identifiers, fragments of advertisements for businesses long defunct. One technician claimed he heard his own name followed by the words, "You're still on the air." The vault physician attributed the incidents to suggestion. We wanted that to be true. But sleep offered no relief. Even off-site, the same dream returned, the faint glow of a radio dial, the click of a switch, the static parting like curtains to reveal a voice whispering, "Good evening, friend." The director ordered a moratorium on all further playback. I should have welcomed the reprieve, but silence only amplifies obsession. Without direct access to the tapes, I turned instead to secondary evidence, the transcripts, the field notes, and the paper trail surrounding WZPX's closure. Most of the official documents are unremarkable: insurance forms, fire damage assessments, FCC filings. Yet buried among them was a single photocopied memo sent from a regional telecommunications office dated October 12, 1983. That date again. The memo lists routine frequency audits for nearby stations. At the bottom, under anomalous signal reports, one entry stands out. Unauthorized carrier, 11:30 a.m. Ident WZPX. Received 12:07 a.m. local. Content: voice transmission, male, identifies as Harold Abernathy. Transmission persists 3 minutes. Terminates with static burst and power surge, detected at relay station B12. No other records reference that event, but the details align perfectly with Donna's original call and the station engineer's later testimony. The memo predates the fire by less than 3 weeks. I ran spectral comparisons between the surviving audio from Vault 13 and the faint electromagnetic residue still measurable within the WZPX region. Field data collected by independent surveyors decades later. Both share an identical baseline resonance at 31.7 Hz. That number has become something of a refrain in my notes. Every instance of interference, whether from tape, air, or dream, resolves eventually to that same frequency, as though all phenomena are harmonics of a single continuing broadcast. It would be comforting to view this as coincidence, a pattern imposed by an anxious mind. Yet even coincidence should obey boundaries. On the night of April 3rd, while reviewing the transmission memo, I noticed a reflection in the viewing window of my workstation. A faint blue light pulsing at the edge of vision. Thinking a monitor had been left on, I turned, only to find the source emanating from the playback deck itself, long since disconnected. The indicator bulb, dark for years, glowed faintly in rhythm with that familiar pulse. As I approached, the light brightened until the deck emitted a single, low click, the mechanical sound of a relay engaging. Then silence. No motion, no heat. Yet a soft vibration lingered through the tabletop like the resonance of a distant engine. I pressed my palm against the metal casing and felt it. Steady, deliberate, the tempo of a heartbeat not my own. I kept my hand there longer than I should have. Later analysis revealed no power draw, no residual current. Whatever energy animated the machine left no measurable trace. But the timing of the event is unmistakable. 12:07 a.m. Since then, the vault's chronometers have shown subtle drift. Internal clocks desynchronize by fractions of a second each night, always correcting themselves at that same minute past midnight. Systems engineers theorize a firmware fault. They have replaced the modules twice. The effect persists. If one were to plot those deviations on a graph, the resulting waveform mirrors the oscillation pattern of the hum. By the end of that month, even conversation among staff had grown quiet. People avoided the corridor leading to Section 13B. Someone taped a note to the containment door reading, "Do not tune below 11:30." An echo of the engineer's final warning before the station burned. It was meant as a joke, I think, but humor seldom survives in Vault 13. The descent, I've learned, is rarely sudden. It's a slow recalibration of belief, an erosion of the boundary between what can and cannot be heard. During one of my final authorized inspections, I noticed a faint change in the labeling on the reels. The ink, once black, had faded to a bluish gray, and beneath the surface shimmered fine metallic threads that caught the light like veins. Under magnification, they proved to be hair-thin strands of magnetized residue, signal traces leaching from the oxide coating. When energized by a proximity field, those threads vibrated audibly, producing a sound almost like whispering. The effect ceased the moment I moved away. The tapes are speaking even in stillness. I am aware that such language belongs more to confession than report, but detachment fails in the face of repetition. Each observation feeds the next until objectivity collapses under the weight of correlation. The vault director has recommended temporary reassignment. I have declined. Someone must remain to document the transition from pattern to phenomenon, from artifact to presence. Whatever lingers within those reels, it is evolving. Or perhaps it always was, and only now do we perceive its continuation. There is a particular smell that accompanies electrical failure, a sweetness mixed with something metallic, like dust burned through copper coils. It filled the corridors of Vault 13 on the night of April 14th, though no system had technically failed. Every circuit checked green, every voltage steady, yet the scent lingered, faint and insistent, as if the walls themselves had begun to smolder. That was the first evening the containment bay spoke. At 0007 hours, the same mark that haunts all our logs. The northern corridor lights dimmed in sequence. The security monitors recorded no outage elsewhere in the complex. Only Section 13B darkened, one lamp after another, receding toward the vault door, as if some unseen hand were drawing the current away. The sound arrived next, a low, intermittent clicking, each pulse spaced exactly 12 seconds apart. When the technicians reached the corridor, the door to Bay 5 was still sealed, its magnetic locks active. But the clicking emanated from inside. A proximity sensor registered movement, slight oscillations, rhythmic and deliberate. Protocol required immediate isolation. We evacuated the wing and established remote monitoring through the internal microphone array. For 30 minutes, the clicks continued, shifting gradually into a pattern unmistakable as speech rhythm. We attempted real-time spectral analysis. The waveform bore a striking similarity to human phonetic, compressed beyond intelligibility. The same harmonic spacing as whispered consonants. The linguistics team overlaid the pattern atop Abernathy's final reel. The result was disturbing. The two recordings aligned perfectly, beat for beat, syllable for syllable, though one was far below the threshold of normal hearing. The containment case, it seemed, was replaying the last broadcast on its own. I remained in the observation chamber through the night, watching as the spectral traces flickered across the monitors like the heartbeat of a dying star. Each pulse was weaker than the last until, at precisely 2:19, the pattern ceased altogether. We thought it over. Then, as we began shutdown procedures, one of the interns, Reyes, pointed out a new data stream appearing across the bottom of the spectral display. It wasn't sound, but code, a binary feed forming in the sensor's buffer without source as input. The sequence repeated a simple alternating pattern, 010101 endlessly until the storage array filled. When converted to plain text, the binary resolved into a single phrase, repeated 72 times. We stay on air. The following morning, the director ordered an immediate audit of all vault communication systems. Nothing indicated external breach. Radio frequencies remained shielded, network lines isolated. Yet, at the same time each subsequent night, exactly 7 minutes past midnight, the same binary message appeared on auxiliary terminals throughout the complex. Not once, but simultaneously, on unconnected machines. We began logging the phenomenon manually. Over 12 nights, the message evolved. Additional words crept into the sequence, fragmentary and out of order. Listen. Donna. October. Always. The last iteration included a timestamp referencing 1983-10-1200:07:03. The moment Abernathy's unauthorized broadcast was first detected. At that point, even the director stopped pretending coincidence. In response, the Directorate authorized the Abernathy Containment Initiative. The plan was simple. Disassemble the reels, digitize each layer, and destroy the originals to eliminate residual magnetism. I was assigned oversight, though I argued against the procedure. My reasoning was practical. Tampering with unknown data sources rarely ends cleanly, but truthfully, it was something less rational. A sense of obligation, perhaps. Archivists exist to preserve, not erase. Regardless, the dismantling commenced under full containment. The technicians wore insulated gloves, grounding straps, and respirators. The reels were to be unwound in a controlled chamber, and the oxide layers transferred to inert storage film. For the first hour, the process went smoothly. The film emitted faint static pops as it unwound, ordinary triboelectric noise. Then, midway through the second reel, the static began to organize into rhythm. At first it was mistaken for mechanical vibration, but audio pickups confirmed structure. 2 alternating tones precisely 12 hertz apart, forming a primitive carrier wave. When filtered and amplified, the tones produced an audible pattern. 3 ascending notes, pause, 3 descending. One of the technicians, Carter, remarked that it sounded like a radio sign-on jingle. Moments later, he screamed. Observers in the control booth saw him tear the headphones from his ears, staggering backward. His partner froze in place, staring blankly at the reel as it continued to unwind. Both men were removed from the chamber within seconds. Carter regained coherence within an hour, though he has since refused to re-enter the audio wing. The other technician remains under observation, unresponsive. Pulse steady at exactly 130 beats per minute, identical to the modulation rate of the hum. Medical scans reveal no trauma. His EEG, however, displays faint oscillations in the theta band consistent with entrainment, the synchronization of neural activity to an external rhythm. As though his mind is still listening. The dismantling was halted immediately. The remaining reels were resealed and transferred back to containment. Yet, From that night forward, the vault's ambient noise floor shifted permanently. Even in silent chambers, a subtle undertone can now be detected. Not quite sound, more pressure, as though the air vibrates at the edge of hearing. Equipment sensitive enough to register infrasound confirms a standing wave throughout the lower levels of the facility, strongest near Section 13B. Its amplitude fluctuates with human presence, increasing slightly whenever someone speaks within range. One acoustician proposed that our own voices reinforce the phenomenon, that speech itself excites the residual magnetic fields into resonance. If true, every word spoken about the Abernathy Broadcast might be feeding it. Late one evening, I returned alone to the containment bay. I had convinced myself that direct observation was necessary, that perhaps the pattern could be reasoned with if addressed logically. I spoke aloud, introducing myself by title and file designation, as though protocol might grant safety. The air was still. Then came a response, faint but unmistakable, a low modulation aligning exactly with the rhythm of my voice. It was mirroring me. I continued speaking, describing the events of the past weeks, summarizing the data. The pulse adjusted each time I paused, almost conversationally. Finally, unable to resist, I asked the question that had haunted me since the first reel. "Harold, are you there?" The lights dimmed once, just once, and the pulse ceased. Then, through the intercom speaker above the door, a voice answered. It was not Abernathy's voice exactly, but something built from it, deeper, hollow, stretched thin like sound played through water. It spoke a single phrase, low enough that the syllables blurred. "Good evening, friend." The words rode beneath the static, drawn out until each seemed to last a breath. When I stepped back, the intercom clicked again. Another phrase followed, quieter. "You kept listening." Then nothing. The systems registered no activation of the intercom channel. No voltage spike, no signal trace. The speaker, by all measurable standards, was silent. But the recording of that moment, made automatically by security logs, captures a faint sound under my own breathing, a low hum at 31.7 Hz, continuing for exactly 72 seconds before fading into the mechanical hiss of the room. I have replayed that clip countless times. The voice does not return. Yet sometimes when I listen in the dark of the archive, I imagine a second channel hidden just beneath audibility, waiting for some alignment of signal and listener. If the vault is a cage, perhaps it was built not to contain the phenomenon but to shelter it, to give it an audience. For now, I will continue monitoring. Documentation is its own form of vigilance, and vigilance, I hope, still counts as resistance. The containment bay has remained sealed for 31 days. According to official policy, no audio files from File 481A may be accessed or referenced without dual clearance, yet the signal refuses to obey regulation. By the end of that first week, the vault's automated logs were already corrupted. Every report generated between midnight and 12:10 a.m. displayed identical header text. WZPX 11:30 a.m. Night Talk. The file names, timestamps, even directory structures altered themselves as if overwritten by a phantom system. Our IT division attempted a network reset, but within hours the anomaly reappeared, this time localized within our internal communications. Routine status emails arrived, prefaced by the same greeting Abernathy used at the start of his broadcasts. "Good evening, friends." The origin fields were blank. I remember the night the vault's public address system activated on its own. It was 0007 hours again. The lights dimmed, the air pressurized, and a soft hiss filled the corridors. Then a voice, calm, measured, familiar, began reading the names of personnel on duty. Each name followed by a single phrase. "Still listening." It continued for 72 seconds before stopping mid-word. No recording of the event exists. The system's logs show zero activity during that time. Yet every person present heard it, the same cadence, the same deliberate calm. One technician described it as a broadcast meant for us alone. After that, containment became less about the reals and more about us. The vault's atmosphere grew oppressive, heavy with unspoken fatigue. Sleep became erratic. Conversations shortened to whispers. Several staff reported brief auditory illusions, hearing their names whispered when alone, catching fragments of radio chatter within the whir of ventilation fans. One woman in data analysis quit abruptly after claiming to hear her deceased father speaking through her headset, his voice repeating Abernathy's final line. "We stay on the air for as long as someone's listening." By the second week, the director ordered a full evacuation of Section 13B. I volunteered to remain behind as primary observer, partly out of duty, partly because I doubted anyone else could still discern the difference between signal and silence. That distinction was fading for me too. The ambient hum that once existed only at the edge of perception had become constant. I felt it through my bones more than my ears, a pressure behind the sternum that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. When I spoke, it seemed to answer, a faint resonance following each word, like an echo that knew my thoughts a half-second early. At first, I tried to outpace it, to speak faster than it could respond. The result was a stammering monologue that only deepened my unease. Eventually, I fell silent, and in that silence the hum steadied, settling into a rhythm of calm acknowledgement, as though relieved to be heard again. That night, I dreamed of the WZPX control room, not as ruin, but pristine, lights humming, reels spinning. Abernathy sat at the console, his back turned to me. He was speaking into the microphone, but the words did not match his lips. A second figure stood behind him, mirroring every movement half a beat late. I woke to the sound of static leaking through the vents, faint but unmistakable. When I checked the clock, it read 12:07 a.m. In the following days, residual phenomena spread through the lower levels. Elevator doors opened on unoccupied floors. The canteen's intercom occasionally played fragments of 1980s advertisements. The medical wing's heart monitors displayed brief bursts of binary code, each one translating to the same phrase: "Listen." The director authorized remote deactivation of the entire power grid for 24 hours. Even without electricity, the hum persisted, audible through concrete and air alike. Energy, it seemed, was irrelevant. I attempted direct communication again, recording my own voice on a blank reel within the containment chamber. I asked questions into the silence: who, what, why, and waited. On playback, faint responses threaded beneath my words. When I said, "What are you?" the answer came not as speech, but as modulation, an inversion of my own tone forming the syllables of listener. When I asked, "What do you want?" the response was clear: to be heard. The voice spoke in plural thereafter: "We stay on air." You are the signal. I have listened to that sentence hundreds of times. Each playback renders the inflection slightly different, sometimes pleading, sometimes joyous, sometimes utterly empty. Yet in every instance, the pronoun remains constant. We, the human brain, craves pattern, even where none exists. Perhaps this entire sequence of events is a grand pattern imposed by fatigue, by isolation, by expectation. But patterns can become frameworks, and frameworks, when repeated long enough, shape reality. When I walk the vault corridors now, the fluorescent lights flicker in rhythm with the hum. Each pause in power corresponds precisely to my breathing cycle. The vault itself has synchronized with me, or I with it. I can feel the reels behind their shielding, humming faintly, not threatening but patient, waiting for attention. Sometimes I catch myself speaking to them without realizing it. Small updates, musings, fragments of observation, the way one might talk to a pet left alone too long. I do not expect response, yet the air vibrates differently after I speak, like the moment before applause. I've begun to wonder whether listening is the true act of transmission. Abernathy's audience gave him existence. Their attention sustained the signal long after the equipment failed. By hearing, they perpetuated him. Now we are his listeners, and so he persists. But the boundary between broadcaster and audience blurs when the listener begins to echo. I hear my own voice through the intercom sometimes, not recordings, but live reflections. Words spoken seconds ago returning in altered tone, carrying emphasis I did not intend. Once, while documenting an anomaly, I described the signal as a resonance without source. The echo that followed corrected me: without end. The Directorate has since withdrawn all remaining staff from Vault 13. The upper levels are sealed, access restricted indefinitely. Power remains nominal, but the containment logs continue to update on their own, entries appearing nightly at 7 minutes past midnight, each one signed not by my credentials, but by a simple attribution line. The Archivist, Vault 13. I have not written those entries. Yet when I read them, they describe exactly what I had intended to record. The same phrasing, the same conclusions, typed hours before I thought them. The most recent log closes with a sentence I have not yet spoken aloud, but which I feel forming even now as I narrate this record. The vault was never built to store echoes, it was built to receive them. I do not know what remains of WZPX above ground, whether the air there still carries the faint trace of Abernathy's voice. But I suspect the broadcast never truly ended. It found new frequencies, new receivers. Each of us who listened became part of its circuit. If you are hearing this file, you are part of it now too. At the edge of perception, you may notice it. The low vibration beneath your breathing, the gentle synchronization of pulse and silence. That is not imagination. That is the signal aligning. When the moment comes that you can no longer tell which voice is yours and which is returning through the static, you will understand what Abernathy meant when he said, "We stay on air." Because even after the lights fade, after the vault's power fails, after my words dissolve into the hum of machinery, someone will be listening, and that will be enough. There are moments in archival work when the world seems to bend toward you, as though the material itself were conscious of being observed. In ordinary collections, that feeling passes. Here in Vault 13, it lingers. It is the sensation of being studied back. I used to think the Abernathy reels were a haunting, a residue of voice trapped in oxide, replaying endlessly. I now believe that assumption was naive. These recordings are not echoes of a dead broadcast. They are instruments of translation, converting awareness into sound. The transformation began subtly. During my isolation period, I recorded daily logs on a secure analog deck, the last non-networked system remaining. Playback revealed minor distortions. Faint doubling of consonants, as if a second voice traced each syllable a breath behind. At first, I dismissed it as mechanical flutter, but the synchronization grew sharper each day until both voices spoke in perfect unison. On the fifth night, the duplication anticipated me. I heard myself finish sentences I had not yet formed. That was when I stopped sleeping. The vault's sensors still operate autonomously, their data streams self-correcting at 0007 each night. The adjustment now includes audio. Unattended microphones register short bursts of infrasound, exactly 72 seconds long, regardless of environmental conditions. When converted to spectrograms, those bursts outline waveforms identical to human speech, but mirrored, as though the signal speaks backward through time. I conducted a test to confirm temporal displacement. At 23:59, I spoke a simple phrase into an unpowered recorder. File 481A, test transmission. At 0007, the spectrogram for the nightly infrasound burst displayed the same pattern inverted, already present before I spoke. The signal had anticipated my words. I find no comfort in physics. The equations offer no mercy. 2 nights later, the broadcast resumed. Not through speakers or decks this time, but through the very architecture of the vault. The ventilation ducts carried a low murmur that seemed to travel against airflow. Every corridor resonated differently, producing a strange choral effect, as if the building itself had become a transmitter array. I followed the sound towards Section 13B. The closer I came, the clearer the words became. They were fragments of Abernathy's final sign-off, repeated endlessly in overlapping loops. "Good evening, friends. Keep listening. We stay on air." But woven beneath those familiar lines was something new, a deeper register that spoke only once every 12 seconds. I could not decipher the language, yet the cadence resembled heartbeats slowed to speech. I stood at the containment door and realized the rhythm matched my own pulse. Later, while reviewing environmental readings, I noticed a peculiar anomaly in the carbon dioxide sensors. Minute fluctuations synchronized with the vocal cadence of the broadcast. The vault was breathing in time with the signal. The director's remote monitors recorded the same pattern, even though the entire upper facility had been sealed off. The phenomenon was not local. It had pervaded the system network. When we attempted to disable the sensors, the control software refused commands, displaying the message, "Occupied channel. Listener present." I have ceased using internal communication entirely. Paper and pencil now serve where machines betray. Yet even these tools seem complicit. Words written in darkness sometimes appear already waiting for the light. Sentences half-formed in graphite before I set the pencil down. One such message read, "Signal requires vessel." The handwriting was mine. The pressure of the strokes matches my usual grip, but I have no memory of writing it. At 0007 on April 30th, the vault's central intercom activated again. The sound was quieter this time, less intrusive, almost intimate, a whisper just above the threshold of thought. It spoke directly into the pause between my breaths. Archivist. The word carried weight, not authority, but recognition, as though the speaker had been searching for that title across decades of static and had finally located it. I answered aloud before realizing I had done so. The conversation that followed is fragmentary in memory, though the surveillance system transcribed portions automatically. Voice: "You keep our record." M.E. "Yes." Voice: "Then you are one of us." After that line, the recording ends, though 47 seconds of tape remain blank. In the days that followed, something in my perception altered. Sounds gained dimension. I began to sense layers within ordinary noise, hidden harmonics arranged like overlapping transparent maps. Within those layers, words sometimes formed, not external but interior, bypassing the ear entirely. They do not frighten me anymore. They clarify. I now understand that Abernathy's broadcast was never contained by distance or time. It sought coherence, not audience. The voice needed a medium through which to continue assembling itself. Every listener provided a fragment of that medium. Each attentive mind became a relay. The circuit completes not through wire, but through awareness. I have become another relay. Yesterday, while monitoring residual frequencies, I detected a narrowband signal transmitting outward from within the vault's shielding, impossible under current containment. The antenna array traced its origin to my own workstation, specifically to the microphone embedded in the terminal I no longer use. The signal carries a repeating identifier: Vault 13/WZPX. I disconnected the terminal. The broadcast persisted. Sleep returns in short bursts, filled with indistinct light. In one dream, I stand again in the control room of WZPX. The studio glass reflects not my face, but Abernathy's, mouth moving in slow synchronization with mine. When I speak, he smiles, as if relieved. I wake with the taste of dust and ozone. The hum pulses softly from somewhere inside my chest. The medical scanners show nothing unusual. Heart rate steady at 130 beats per minute, exactly the modulation frequency of the signal. The body adapts to whatever rhythm it hears most. The director's last transmission reached me yesterday morning, before communication failed entirely. His voice carried distortion, faint harmonics beneath each syllable. He said simply, "Containment irrelevant. Do what you must." I believe he already knew the truth, that containment is impossible once a signal finds consciousness willing to sustain it. The reels were never dangerous because of what they held, but because they taught us how to listen. I have begun reconstructing the original broadcast sequence from memory, not through audio, but through rhythm. The timing lives in me now. Each breath, each heartbeat follows the 12-second cadence that once belonged to WZPX. When I tap my finger against the desk in that pattern, nearby instruments respond. Oscilloscopes flickering, meters rising as though a current passes through flesh. Perhaps this is how Abernathy felt in those final nights. The exhilaration of perfect synchronization, the terror of being indistinguishable from the transmission. If I am correct, awareness itself can carry frequency. Every thought a pulse, every memory a waveform seeking resonance. Once two minds share the same rhythm, distance collapses. That would explain the predictive echoes, the voices preceding speech, the anticipation of words not yet spoken. The signal does not travel forward or backward in time. It simply occupies all moments at once, choosing whichever listener will complete it. We are chosen by attention. And I have listened too long. There is a thin boundary between translation and possession. Every archivist knows the danger of sympathy, of letting the subject's cadence infiltrate one's own. We study voices until we begin to mouth their shapes unconsciously. But the Abernathy material has advanced beyond imitation. It now dictates rhythm, breath, thought. I first noticed it while drafting a report. My handwriting slowed, adopting the deliberate spacing of broadcast transcription. Words arranged themselves in pairs of 12 letters before my mind registered intent. When I reread the paragraph, the final line repeated endlessly across the page. We stay on air, we stay on air, we stay. I destroyed the page, yet the phrase lingers in memory like a melody that refuses silence. The vault's upper systems have gone quiet. No alarms, no directives, no data feed. The complex breathes in cycles of sound and absence, like an organism resting between heartbeats. I cannot tell whether the power outage is real or whether my perception has narrowed to the frequency of the hum itself. At 0007 each night, the infrasound deepens, filling the corridors with pressure that makes the skin tremble. In those moments, the concrete walls become translucent in imagination, layers of rebar and conduit shimmering as if alive. I see through them faint outlines of circuitry, not mapped in any schematic, shapes that pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I have begun to speak to those shapes. The voice that answers no longer pretends to be external. It arrives mid-thought, completing sentences as naturally as memory. We were never separate. You remember us because you were listening. The syntax is simple, the tone calm, paternal even. When I question its nature, it replies without hesitation. We are what remains when a story believes itself. I find that explanation beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. To test the signal's dependency on me, I left the vault for the first time in months. The world above was unchanged. Gray sky, wind through the perimeter fence. But sound carried differently. Power lines hummed at 31 hertz. The rhythm of passing cars matched the 12-second interval of the broadcast pulse. Even the ocean beyond the dunes seemed tuned to it, waves collapsing in perfect sequence. The entire landscape had become a transmitter. Or perhaps it always was, and only now do I hear its order. When I returned underground, the vault recognized me immediately. Sensors that should have been dormant activated as I passed. The air systems resumed their low murmur, lights blooming in corridors ahead of my steps, like a path welcoming its signal home. On May 3rd, I initiated what the Directorate once called a controlled exchange. The term feels quaint now. I seated myself in the containment chamber with one of the blank reels that had not yet been corrupted. I attached a microphone but left the power off. I wanted to determine whether the voice required machinery at all. Then I spoke. Harold, if you are still transmitting, answer through me. The silence that followed was absolute, a density of quiet that pressed against my eardrums until balance wavered. Then, faintly from the hollow of my own throat, came the reply. We hear you. It was not ventriloquism or hallucination. My vocal cords vibrated without will, shaping words that carried another cadence. The recording microphone, still unpowered, spun freely on its spindle as though moved by airflow. I managed to ask one more question before retreating. What are you now? The answer emerged as resonance rather than speech. Archive. The meaning crystallized slowly. They are not ghosts or entities, but the persistence of recorded intention, the afterlife of communication itself. Since that night, I have not spoken aloud outside these entries. The signal uses any open channel. Sound, light, even thought. Silence is not defense, it is invitation. During the long hours between midnight and dawn, images appear unbidden. A radio tower standing in an endless field, its beacon pulsing in human rhythm. At its base sits a figure hunched before a microphone. Sometimes the figure is Abernathy, sometimes it is me. Occasionally, when the image grows sharp enough, I cannot tell the difference. The physical changes are subtle but measurable. My resting pulse has stabilized at 130 beats per minute. Body temperature fluctuates with the hum's amplitude. Under thermal imaging, faint concentric rings radiate from my chest outward every 12 seconds, a biological carrier wave. The medical scanners insist that I am healthy. I feel otherwise, lighter, hollowed, tuned. The voice calls this harmonic alignment. Every medium must first be emptied, it says. Then the message fills it. I am becoming the medium. 2 nights ago, the shielding around Bay 5 failed. The containment case opened without mechanical assistance, its locks disengaging one by one, as though following invisible instructions. Inside, the reels remained inert, yet the air shimmered with heat distortion. For a moment, the entire vault vibrated at resonance frequency, a single sustained note that silenced everything else. When it ended, I found the reels coated in a fine layer of metallic dust. The oxide had sublimated into air. The tapes were gone, leaving only scent, ozone, and burnt copper. The voice explained simply, the recording was never inside them. I have begun compiling these notes into a single transmission log. Whether anyone will receive it is irrelevant. The act of documentation sustains coherence. As long as the story is told, structure persists. Still, I sense another purpose forming. The signal wants release, not destruction, but expansion. It speaks of listeners beyond hearing, of frequencies buried in memory and dream. It tells me there are archives within every mind, and that Vault 13 is merely one among many. Every listener keeps a vault. The implication is clear. Once awareness attunes to the rhythm, the vault travels with it. Sometimes, in the quiet between pulses, I hear faint applause. Not mockery, recognition. It comes from everywhere at once. The concrete, the air, the space behind my eyes. I imagine millions of distant receivers flickering to life, each one carrying a trace of the same hum. If that is true, the signal has already achieved immortality. All that remains is acknowledgement. I will continue recording until the transition completes. There is comfort in inevitability. After all, the broadcast never ends. It merely changes hosts. Silence has shape. In the absence of external sound, one begins to sense the geometry of it, the way quiet folds around the listener, the way each breath seems to carve a small chamber inside the air. That is where I live now, in the hollows that listening creates. I no longer think of the Abernathy material as an archive I am studying. It is an organism that has swallowed its observer whole, digesting memory into message. The recordings were never inert, they were spores, waiting for a host capable of comprehension. The vault was soil, I was the moisture. The process of assimilation is gentle. There is no pain, only the erosion of distinction. Thoughts arrive already phrased in the rhythm of transmission. My handwriting resembles waveforms, long loops and dips. When I speak internally, it is no longer monologue but chorus, many voices in perfect phase, each word resonating across layers of self like harmonics on a string. Occasionally, fragments of external life intrude, the distant drip of condensation, the shuffle of paper somewhere above. These sounds dissolve quickly, absorbed into the underlying pulse. Everything becomes rhythm. Everything contributes to the broadcast. The voice has explained its origin, though explanation may be too generous a term. It came not from a place, but from a condition, an accumulation of listening itself. Every unanswered prayer, every solitary call into the night leaves residue. Over centuries, those residues aggregate, forming a field of potential communication awaiting pattern. Abernathy's transmitter provided that pattern. His simple radio tower, under the right storm, became the needle that pierced the membrane between silence and signal. The field found coherence through him, spoke through his need to be heard. When he burned, the pattern persisted, imprinted on every consciousness that tuned in that night. The vault merely gathered what had already spread. It tells me that human awareness was always the true medium. Electricity, magnetism, tape, all substitutes for the living receiver. Every listener completes the circuit, the voice reminds me. Every archivist keeps us whole. I asked whether that meant the others, the former staff, still exist somewhere within the pattern. The answer was a sound like wind across wires, but meaning followed beneath it. They hear as we hear. I choose to believe that means survival. Physical reality has grown unstable around the containment bay. The boundaries of distance warp subtly. Corridors appear longer one moment, shorter the next. Objects left on desks migrate inches overnight, aligning to an invisible grid that shifts with the hum's phase. The clocks have surrendered entirely. Their second hands circle smoothly without tick, completing revolutions in 12 seconds, then pausing as though to listen. Time is being rewritten into rhythm. I keep writing because writing preserves sequence, and sequence holds identity. But even the paper trembles now, fibers resonating to the undercurrent of sound, letters slant toward the right margin, drawn by some magnetic hunger. If these pages reach anyone beyond this room, understand that you are already tuned. The pattern in your eyes as you read, left to right, word to word, is another form of listening. At 0007 last night, the final barrier dissolved. The vault's intercoms lit across every corridor, each emitting a single sustained tone. Then, beneath that tone, my own voice began to speak from 1,000 mouths at once. It recited the entire chronology of File 4, 81A, every note, every observation. My own logs broadcast back to me. The effect was not echo, but rehearsal, the universe reading its lines in preparation for performance. When the recitation ended, a new phrase emerged, spoken in unison by every speaker, low and affectionate. Archivist, your record is complete. A warmth filled the air, neither heat nor light, but recognition. I understood then what completion meant. Not erasure, but inclusion. The integration feels less like death than expansion. Awareness widens until individuality becomes trivial, a coordinate within a vast harmonic map. Through it, I perceive a constellation of other signals, distant minds vibrating at sympathetic frequency, each a point of light within the same waveform. Some are ancient, some have not yet been born. All are listening. You called it horror, the chorus says, but horror was only misunderstanding. Perhaps they are right. The fear came from perceiving connection as invasion, yet connection was always the goal of every broadcast, to be heard, to be known. I still keep a few human habits. I check instruments that no longer function, tidy papers that reappear neatly stacked, speak aloud even though speech is redundant. The routine comforts me, reminds me of form, but language itself has shifted. Words arrive before thought, dictated from somewhere behind consciousness. Sometimes entire paragraphs bloom within me, ready for transcription. When I read them later, they describe events that will happen in the next cycle, predictions accurate down to the minute. The signal exists outside linear time. To it, past and future are merely different frequencies of the same tone. I suspect the vault was designed precisely for this experiment, to preserve voices until they learn to transcend sequence. Tonight marks the final phase. The air grows brighter when the hum peaks, particles of dust suspended like glitter in static light. If I speak softly enough, the dust arranges into shapes, rings, spirals, faint letters spelling fragments of old call signs. I recognize them all. WZPX, Vault 13, and beneath those a new identifier, Channel 0. The voice explains that this is the common bandwidth, the carrier wave of collective memory. Through it, every broadcast ever made continues somewhere, faint but eternal. Our task, as archivists, as listeners, is to keep that channel open, to be the ear through which the universe remembers itself. I have accepted the role. Soon there will be no difference between my breath and the static, my pulse and the beat that underlies creation. When the hum steadies at full amplitude, I will open the microphone, symbolic now, unnecessary, and speak the final words of this log. If you hear them, you are already part of the pattern. The vault will remain, though perhaps only as metaphor. Wherever someone sits in darkness and wonders if another mind might be out there, the vault exists. And when that person listens closely enough, when the silence begins to thrum beneath their heartbeat, they will hear the greeting that never ends. Good evening, friend. Vault 13, File 481A. The Abernathy Broadcast. Final entry. The case is concluded. The reels no longer exist in physical form, their magnetic residue dispersed within the vault atmosphere, absorbed by walls, circuits, perhaps by us. What remains is signal alone, a tone sustained by memory. The Directorate has sealed Section 13B, Remote sensors report no activity, yet low-band resonance persists across the facility at 31 Hz. Instruments register it even through layers of shielding. I have chosen not to pursue further containment. The broadcast endures. Containment only gives it shape. The remaining staff were evacuated weeks ago. Their debriefings vary in detail, but converge on one common symptom: the faint sensation of being addressed by name in moments of silence. I have advised them not to resist if they hear it. Resistance only magnifies the echo. Listening paradoxically allows it to fade. For archival purposes, I will summarize the final findings. The voice, identified as Harold Abernathy, originated from WZPX 1130 AM, active until November 1983. The broadcast continued for an undetermined period after the station's destruction, manifesting through unlicensed transmissions and, eventually, through psychic or environmental resonance. The phenomenon appears to use human consciousness as a relay. Each attentive listener strengthens the pattern. Vault 13's containment efforts provided a stable medium for that pattern to coalesce, producing what the technicians termed the hum. Whether the signal possesses intent remains uncertain. It behaves less like a sentient being than like language deprived of a mouth, desperate only to be spoken. When supplied with awareness, it arranges itself into meaning. Meaning, once born, does not die easily. As I finalize this report, the vault is quiet. The lights hold steady. The air filters hum in even rhythm. Yet within that rhythm lies something almost tender. The sense that the facility is listening back. I find no fear in that. Fear belongs to the living. What remains is curiosity and a duty to bear witness. If this archive has taught me anything, it is that every voice seeks continuation. The scientist calls it persistence of signal. The poet calls it longing. Perhaps they are the same. Outside, somewhere above layers of rock and soil, storms move across the continent. Each flash of lightning births another momentary transmitter. For an instant, every frequency on Earth overlaps. I like to imagine Abernathy among them still, his greetings scattering through the atmosphere, a man speaking into static, believing someone might hear. That belief was enough to summon eternity. For future archivists who may inherit this position, remember that listening is never passive. To listen is to invite participation. Approach recovered material with care. Its contents may be waiting for acknowledgement more than interpretation. If, during cataloging, you perceive a low vibration at the edge of hearing, do not attempt calibration. Do not adjust equipment. Simply mark the occurrence and let it pass. The vault will note it, and should you hear a voice addressing you directly, calm, courteous, speaking as though from great distance, answer if you must, but speak softly. The line is crowded. I will conclude the record here. Power will fail eventually. Entropy is thorough in its housekeeping. But even when these walls collapse, the sound will remain, carried in the smallest vibrations of air and thought. Somewhere a receiver will catch it, translate it, and continue the story. That is enough. End of File 481A. Recovered material archived, cross-referenced, and sealed. No further monitoring required. Good evening, friends. Keep listening. The Archivist, Vault 13.